Good morning, everybody. I'm flipping my way over. I ran a church to get some work done, left my teaching Bible at home, so I just grabbed a pew Bible here. We are in Acts chapter 13, and we'll be starting in verse 13 today. Once you find your place, since I found mine, chime in and say hi. Good morning, Arla. So, let's see here. I'm going to be missing some of my notes, but I will say this. Notice verse 13. We have a change. Now when Paul and his party set sail from Paphos. So they're leaving Cyprus. They're going to head back up to the mainland. This is where some of the stuff's really exciting in that the life and epistles of St. Paul. In that book I mentioned yesterday, and I put a link in it in yesterday's video on Amazon. But all that said, very exciting hearing about the hows and the whys of where they went and how they got there and all these things. But Paul is now the leader. He's now being called Paul, not Saul. His name has changed, and with that, you see his role has changed. He's now the leader of the group. Now, I mentioned I was going to look this up before, and it is approximately 14 years have gone by since the road to Damascus. And so it's a good reminder that the book of Acts is filled with many miracles and healings and signs and wonders. But just from Acts chapter 9, a few pages over to Acts chapter 13, we have 14 years going by. And so this book is filled with a lot of amazing things, but remember, it's also over a long period of time. I think sometimes we think that everything should be going, like gangbusters, like we read in the Bible, but we forget, no, this is many miracles over a long period of time. And so Paul the Apostle here, he's taking off from Paphos. They came to Perga in Pamphylia, which is a city there on the coast, and they came to Antioch in Pisidia. So they don't spend much time on the coast, and they march their way up into the middle of modern-day Turkey. And it says, and John departing from them returned to Jerusalem. Now, here's the thing about John Mark. Again, it's John Mark, like the Gospel of Mark. He takes off, and we don't know why. We don't know what happens. We don't know what the scenario was at this time. What we do know is that in Acts chapter 15, I believe, at the end of the chapter, when Paul's ready to take off on his second missionary journey, him and Barnabas are ready to go. And Barnabas is like, hey, let's take John Mark again. And Saul's like, no way. Paul says, no, he ditched on us. He bailed. And I'm not going to take this kid again because he walked out on us. And we'll see how I can do without all my notes. But what you're going to find is that Paul takes Silas on that second missionary journey. And him and Silas go off. They have a great time. Mark ends up going with Barnabas. And they end up going and doing their own missionary journey, which we have written for us in church tradition and history, but it didn't make it in the Bible. But Barnabas and Mark take off on their own. And they go off preaching the gospel. And actually what happens is, firstly, we're going to see a couple cool things here, is that the gospel divides and actually spreads more, right? Because you can reach more people with two groups doing missionary journeys rather than just one group. Secondly, but you find division. It seems as if Paul and Barnabas have a big fight, a big falling out. Now, if you take a look at 2 Timothy, in 2 Timothy, I'm trying to find it. There we go. You're going to see a mention of Mark. Paul mentions him in his writings later on, and he'll just mention him briefly. But here's the thing, is Paul the Apostle, he's setting off now on this first missionary journey, and that's really why we know him. If he had never done the missionary journeys, I mean, he was there at the stoning of Stephen, that's a big deal, but we know Paul the Apostle because he traveled around, he planted all these churches, and he wrote half the New Testament as he wrote letters to the churches and to some of the young pastors whom he had planted along the way. At the very end of Paul's life, so there's the beginning, we're now jumping all the way to the end. In 3 of Paul's epistles, he mentions a guy by the name of Demas. Earlier on, Demas is mentioned as a fellow brother, fellow soldier, fellow worker. He's a guy who was with him along the way. And he was a beloved friend and a beloved person in ministry, right? Like a fellow soldier that he was taking the battlefield with. 2 Timothy is the last epistle we have by Paul the Apostle. Paul was under the impression that he was about to be executed. I am under the belief that he actually doesn't get executed here in 2 Timothy and ends up coming back around later before getting executed the second time he gets imprisoned at Rome. But he's in prison. He says in 2 Timothy 4:6, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. And not only me, but all those who've loved his appearing." And so he's kind of pouring his heart out. 2 Timothy is a very emotional book for me because you see Paul the Apostle at his end pouring out his heart, pouring out all that he's done for God. And then he tells them in verse 9 of 2 Timothy 4, "Be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica. Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia, and only Luke is with me." Luke wrote the book of Acts. We haven't gotten to him yet. He'll show up on the scene very soon now. But Paul's now getting abandoned. Some guys are going because they're being called to ministry, but here's one of Paul's close friends, brothers, the kind of people that you bleed with and you sweat with, and he walks away. The love of this present world pulls Demas away. And here's Paul at the very end, believing he's near to death. And in the next section, after saying, "Only Luke is with me," he says, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry." Back here in Acts chapter 13, where we started, we see where Mark leaves. John, Mark, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. And it created a huge division. Paul and Barnabas obviously were very good friends. I can only imagine, someone like Aaron Bloom being my Barnabas. A guy that you've done ministering with, you've done witnessing with. I've gone around door to door with that guy. And, to imagine a fight so intense that we would divide and go separate ways. Really not to talk to each other or almost never see each other ever again. I mean, that's a big deal. And that whole fight was over John Mark. Mark was really young, remember. I mean, he was a teenager back at the crucifixion. And so he's one of the younger guys in the group. And he was probably immature. Maybe Mark wasn't ready for ministry. Now, we see two things here. One thing we see is that we ought to never lose hope of restoration. Mark, who created all this division, and obviously, whatever happens here, right? Mark departs. It doesn't tell us, but whatever happened, the circumstances, they were significant enough that Paul said, "Barnabas, I'd rather leave you than go with him." And so whatever Mark did here, he obviously bailed, and it frustrated Paul. And yet at the very end, when others were bailing, Paul says, "Bring Mark. He's useful to me. He's a guy I can use." And so not only is it the restoration to look forward, but of a relationship, but it's also restoration in ministry. Some of us will make big mistakes while we are born again. We will do the things that we thought were unthinkable, and oftentimes follows with a season of needing to take a back seat. There's a season of just healing that has to take place. A season where might not get used like we were for a while. But we need to stay faithful and we need to hold fast. You see, if you or I got caught up in some grievous sin, and rightly so, there's discipline that takes place. I could do things that could disqualify me from being a pastor, and I would immediately be done. I would not be teaching. I would not be counseling. I wouldn't be doing anything. And with that kind of a hit to something so important to me, I could just want to give up and quit. If I can't be a pastor, then I'm just never going to, whatever, I'm just done. I'm done with my faith. I'm done with God. I mean, like, whatever, and just walk away. Yet John Mark, he doesn't walk away. He was not ready for the ministry that was thrust upon him on that first missionary journey. He wasn't fit for it. He just wasn't mature enough yet to handle that responsibility. And so he ends up just breaking under the pressure and he leaves. But if Mark had quit, well, we wouldn't have the Gospel of Mark, right? We wouldn't have these things that he contributed. Mark would follow Barnabas for a good season. Eventually, Mark, tradition has it, became the right-hand man of the Apostle Peter. This is why many scholars believe if you read the Gospel of Mark, there are some interesting perspectives of Peter in that gospel, some more personal, and it's because of their relationship. He grew very close to Peter, and they were together, that many say that although Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, in many ways it's kind of the Gospel of Peter. Peter gave a heavy influence on that gospel. And so it's a beautiful gospel to read, to get a little bit of an angle from Peter's view on things. And later on, we then find Demas forsaking, everyone's going different ways, and then once again, John Mark, he's valuable to Paul the Apostle. What is this all to say in the one verse that we got done today? Well, faithfulness. I've been talking about that some lately. Paul, blinded and beat down on the road to Damascus, receives his sight, and he wants to preach, and he gets ran out of Damascus. He goes to Jerusalem, and neither Peter nor James would see him. They refused to meet with him. And Barnabas was the guy that opened the door so Paul could get in there. If Paul had quit, imagine if Paul had given up. Imagine if after 10 years, Paul's like, you know what? I really thought God saved me for a purpose, but I'm just an errand boy. I'm just doing small fry ministry. I think I'm just going to quit. 14 years into the ministry, and Paul gets called to the mission field where he changes the face of history. John Mark got trying too soon, had to quit. He just couldn't handle the pressures of ministry, and he could have given up. But because of him, we have the Gospel of Mark. Who knows to what extent he assisted, aided, and was useful in ministry to Paul here in 2 Timothy chapter 4. I guess it just gets back down to is that we can't quit. We have to keep going The Bible is full of too many stories. I've already kind of preached this message before recently. We talked about Joshua. Joshua was in his 80s or 90s when he fought the Battle of Jericho. You know, the movies always portray him as some young guy. No, he was 80, 90 years old when he fought the Battle of Jericho. He probably figured whatever God was going to use him for was behind him. He figured my big lot in life was being one of the two good spies, him and Caleb. But no, he stayed faithful and God used him up into his 80s, 90s, up until he was past 100 before he finally finished conquering. And so however old you are, however long you've been doing ministry and trying to do something for the Lord, no matter how many disappointments you have faced, hold fast. Don't give up. Maybe you won't become Paul the Apostle, but who knows what God might do through those who stay faithful to him and hang in there until the very end. So, hold fast. God's still got a use for you. And if you've been shot down or you failed in ministry and you've experienced failure, perhaps moral failure, hold fast. Hang in. God's not done. Love you guys. Hope you guys tune back in tomorrow, 7:30. I will be right here. Have an amazing day.